Okay. Let me first of all talk about the temporal single system interpretation of Marx's value theory. That's an interpretation not of Marx in general, not of the book Capital in general, not even of Marx's value theory in general. It's an interpretation of two issues that Marx addressed. Regarding the determination of commodities' values and their prices. The issue is whether Marx understood prices and values to be determined temporally or simultaneously. Okay, so that's where the temporal comes from. And so one simple way of understanding that issue is you have things that go into production, you have stuff that comes out. The stuff that goes in we call inputs, the stuff that comes out we call output. So simultaneous determination of input and output prices or values, or simultaneous valuation says that maybe not in reality, but when we do economic theory, if you do it simultaneously, the price or the value of the input per unit has to be equal to the price or value of the output per unit. So if you have farmers planting corn, and then, seed corn, and then they harvest the corn, a bushel of corn planted at the start of the year has to be equal, has to have a price or value equal per bushel, $5 per bushel, to the price or value of the corn that is harvested at year's end. And the same goes for, you can imagine the workers being paid in corn. And so they eat the corn. So, if they receive corn at the start of the year, say that the price or value per bushel that they receive is equal to the price or value at the end. That's simultaneous valuation. Nobody believes that prices or values are actually constant over time, but simultaneous theorists, those who do simultaneous valuation, say for one or another reason, when you do it theoretically, theoretical models, theoretical reasoning, the input prices per unit have to equal the output prices, or input values have to equal the output values. Okay. Temporality is just the opposite. There's no such restriction. Okay. Prices per unit, the values per unit can differ over the course of the production period, and it's not a technical matter because it really goes to the heart of Marx's value theory, which says that the value of a commodity is determined by the amount of labor needed to produce it. So if you have inputs produced last period, and then you've got this period's production, you've got the outputs, and it takes less labor to produce them, and that determines the value, it just stands to reason that the value of the outputs and the price of the outputs will tend to fall compared to where you started. Okay. So that's temporality, or temporal valuation, as opposed to simultaneous valuation. Okay. So you have the temporal single system interpretation. That was the thumbnail sketch of the temporal part. Single system has to do with, I've talked about values, I've talked about prices. For various historical reasons that we may be able to get into, I won't touch on it too much, a lot of Marxist economists began to think of values and prices constituting two distinct systems of determination. So there was a price system in which prices determined prices, the prices of the inputs determined the rate of profit in price terms, the price of the output, and over here, an entirely distinct value system where values determine values. The values of the inputs determine the value rate of profit, the values of the outputs. And basically never the twain shall meet. Okay. And this caused all kinds of problems, because the whole purpose of when Marx says that the value of a commodity is determined by the amount of labor to produce it, he was actually trying to make that a part of a general argument about the real world, what happens, in the real world, phenomenal level to actual prices. Okay. So he was trying not to separate the two, But for various technical reasons, it was viewed that this was not feasible and that values and prices had to be so separated. And at that point, you're basically trying to fit a round peg into a square hole, or vice versa, when you try to connect values and prices. And it basically didn't work. So about the time that the temporal single system comes along, things were a total mess. And the opponents of Marx's value theory, Schrafians, people like Nobuo Kishio, who I wouldn't exactly call a Schrafian, they had basically made mincemeat out of Marx's value theory, said it doesn't work, said that if you want to make, Marxian economics progress, you just have to jettison Marx's value theory. And if it was somebody like Ian Stephen, the Schrafian, they said what you need to do is embrace physical determination, where basically underlying it all, is we've got the corn that we're producing, and if you plant 10 bushels of corn and the workers eat another 10 bushels of corn, so that's 20 bushels of corn invested. If you get 30 bushels of corn at the end of the year, that's an increase of 10. So 10 compared to the 20 that you started with, that's 50%. So that's your 50% rate of profit. Okay. That's physicalism or physical determination. Okay. And they said basically what the economy does is it runs on this physical basis, and then there are these values and prices, and they just kind of mess things up, and they do so in two different directions. If we get the value system, we got the price system. So basically things were kind of a mess, and nothing was working. And there were various attempts to defend Marx's value theory, but in the 1970s, until the very end, people were still trying to do this without throwing out either simultaneous valuation or throwing out the notion of a dual system. Okay, and it just really didn't work. So various efforts came along either to modify this notion of a dual system, or to jettison it entirely, or to jettison the dual system notion and to jettison the notion of simultaneous valuation. And it's not just a question of jettisoning it for purposes of getting results that you want, but it goes to the accuracy of one's interpretation of Marx. So the real issue is, was Marx himself a theorist who valued inputs and outputs simultaneously, or did he do so temporally, such that the inputs can differ, the input prices can differ from the output prices? So the temporal single system interpretation began to be developed. This was in the days before the internet and email, and people were not much in communication. So it began to sort of pop up here, there, elsewhere among a few people. I won't go into all of the blow-by-blow historical antecedents, but basically, by the early 80s, there were a core of people, each of whom had more or less independently developed aspects or the entirety of the temporal single system interpretation. Originally, there was not a lot of focus on this interpretation. There wasn't a lot of interest. The public outside of the small group of Marxian economists did not hear about it for a long time. In the main, the other Marxist economists and the Schrafians looked at it and continue to look at it as a trick in the main. And therefore, they ignored it. They dismissed it. They called names. You're obscurantists, you're dogmatists. You think you've got a direct line to Marx. Marx isn't necessarily right about everything. Those kinds of things that did not go to the issue of the need for an interpretation to make sense of what the author is saying. And I think that is really one of the main innovations coming from the temporal single system interpretation people, the idea that instead of asking the question, did Marx get it right, we kind of flip that around and we say, have these other people gotten Marx right? So instead of saying, here's the world, and did Marx get the world right, we have to understand that we are dealing with theory. We're dealing with, as Rick Wolff has recently written, we're dealing with an epistemological issue. Not just here's the plain brute reality out there. We're coming to this from a theoretical vantage point. So it's not a question of did Marx get it right. There is no it. Right? You could say one theory explains reality better than another, but that was not the issue. The issue was Marx's theory in itself internally inconsistent, logically incoherent. If arguments are logically inconsistent, that means that the conclusions of the argument are necessarily not derived validly. The argument is invalid. The conclusions might happen to be correct. Socrates was a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates was Greek. The conclusion happens to be correct, but the argument is complete garbage. Okay? So not everybody was saying that Marx was necessarily wrong in his conclusions, but that his arguments were faulty. Okay? So this is the kind of issue that we're dealing with. We're not dealing with, can we explain the real world, although I'm going to come to that. The issue is, does Marx even have a theory in the full sense of the word, something that hangs together and makes sense on its own terms? Okay? So it's not a question of did Marx get it right. Okay? So it's a question of then, is there a theory here that's internally consistent, not self-contradictory? And so the question is, are the people who are claiming that Marx is internally inconsistent, did they get Marx right? Have they gotten Marx right? Did he, in fact, value inputs and outputs simultaneously? Did he, in fact, say that there was two systems of values and prices? Okay. Is there a need for two systems of values and prices within the context of this theory? Okay. If the answer is no, you've got the temporal single system interpretation, and it does away with the alleged inconsistencies, and it's therefore preferable, I would argue, a preferable interpretation precisely because it makes Marx make sense. And I developed that argument in detail in my book, Reclaiming Marx's Capital, a refutation of the myth of inconsistency. Okay, so that's the temporal single system interpretation, which is purely an exercise in interpretation of trying to understand Marx so that he makes sense in his own terms. Trying to see if we can understand his theory in a way that is logically consistent. Then there is temporal value theory. Okay? And that's what these sessions today are about. It's not ever possible to totally separate the two issues. But the TSSI, temporal single system interpretation, is an interpretation, and therefore I think it's crucial when you evaluate it, you have to evaluate it in terms of what it's meant to do. It's meant to provide an alternative account of what Marx himself was saying, an account such that the alleged inconsistencies are no longer there. Then we come to theory. The task of theory is to make sense of the outer world. So you evaluate theories. We evaluate theories in the normal way. Are they compatible with the evidence? And in a plausible way. How much are they able to account for? And in terms of the consistency of the theory. So what we're talking about is largely here theory rather than interpretation today. So what we're doing, and each of us does different things. It's not a homogeneous body of people who all, think in lockstep when you talk about the proponents of the TSSI. There's not homogeneity. But when you talk about temporal value theory, what people are trying to do is to take Marx's value theory, by and large, as understood by the temporal system interpretation, and try to explain phenomena, try to account for real-world phenomena on the basis of Marx's value theory when understood as one in which values and prices are determined temporally and unified in a single system. That's what I have to say, but maybe I should take a comment or question, or Alan can, before we move to the presentations. The session ends at 2:20. We have another hour.
So I know, like when we're doing these tutorials, what it is people are looking for. But I don't think you're most of our tree temporal.
Yeah, Alan will deal with that.
Okay.
So, one thing that it seems that is implicit in, or maybe explicit in your assumption, is when Marx talks about the value of a commodity, he talks about the value expanding through the labor process. It seems like this is more consistent, or a temporal explanation is more consistent with the value of a commodity expanding through the duration of labor time, through that process, as opposed to the other one. And so it does seem theoretically consistent.
Right. Now, the people on the other side would say, yeah, value expands through the production process, but I would agree with you for the following reason. Okay. Let's say you've got your 10 bushels of corn planted at seed. Let's add the workers' corn that they eat. Okay. So the total investment is 10 bushels of corn. And the output is, let's say, 15 bushels of corn. Okay. And let's say you're holding the value of the price of corn constant. Let's hold it at like $1. Keep it easy. So if you're doing simultaneous valuation, the value of the price of corn as an input is 1. As an output, it's 1. So you begin with 10, you end with 15. Now, you can say value self-expands through the production process, through the extraction of, new value through living labor. But the point is, you start with 10, you end with 15, whether you got workers working 1,000 hours, 500 hours, 10 hours, 1 hour, not at all. Okay? If you do simultaneous valuation, the amount of labor that workers do has no influence on the difference between what you start with and you end with. Okay? Not in any sense that really matters.
Perhaps I should, hearing those questions is useful, and I'll try and respond to them. So, Alan Freeman, what you used to do when you started things like this is you used to put up a little slide where you say, if you want to get hold of me, here's my website, email, publications. And actually, it's much easier than that. But both of us would be very happy to answer any questions you have subsequent to this exercise. And if you want to get in touch with us in the modern age of Web 2.0, you just Google us. If you Google Alan Freeman, you'll find it. First of all, you'll find this job. And the longer time goes on, the longer I live, the more likely I move up the list in one Google entry per year. Slow temporal process. So the second thing is that if you want to ask questions at any time you stop, please do. I'm always intensely embarrassed about these situations where I'm supposed to have knowledge that I'm giving people who may very well know more than me in many different ways. So just stop and interrupt. It's not very important. The first thing, what I'm basically trying to do is we sort of divided things up between us this way. I'm just going to try and explain what the differences are between the temporal and simultaneous stroke equilibrium approach and why they make a difference. And then Andrew's basically, I hope I've got this right, I'm going to focus on the rate of profit and the appreciation, which is one of the questions was about. So that's excellent. Well, just to show that we didn't cook all this up, I've got a quote from an economist, a historian of thought, Thomas Sowell, where he himself explains that there are basically two approaches to analysing the economy. And in the history of thought, he calls these sequential. Now, sequential gets a variety of names. Some people call it successivist. That was what von Bogdanovich called it. We call it temporal, in time. They all mean the same thing. So if you hear the word sequential, the word successivist, or the word temporal, they're just different words that people use at different times for the same thing. And this guy has called it sequential. The other thing he says, which is different from that, is simultaneous mutual determination. And that's got a number of synonyms too, which is always confusing from the beginning. So he says, for example, this is Walrasian general equilibrium. That's another synonym. It's sometimes called comparative statics. And it's also the same as the method that most Marxists use in order to interpret Marx's own system, following a very important Austrian theoretician called von Bogdanovich in 1905, then as almost resuscitated, but a lot of attention paid to this man, like Paul Sweezy. This then becomes the very standard interpretation of Marxist value theory, and there's a debate which issues between people like Marishima and then Steedman and Sraffa. All these guys have the basic same framework. I don't have the citation here, but Google me and mail me and I'm happy to send it to you. Sweezy and Marishima both very clearly say, in order to understand Marx, we have to understand that he was a general equilibrium theorist. So the two interpretations that Andrew has spoken about are sequential temporal, which is when A causes B causes C in time, and either simultaneous mutual determination or Walrasian general equilibrium, when everything determines everything else at once, when no distinction in time is made. Now, and as I say, this is not just me saying. Let's start with the simplest possible thing, something to try out on the teachers. The supply-demand curve. How would a successivist, if you're just doing 101 economics, you get told this very simple. This is the supply curve, this is the demand curve, and the price and quantity will be fixed at the intersection of those two curves. Now there's a problem, which is the actual price you see in the world and the actual quantity you see in the world doesn't in fact appear at the intersection of those curves. In fact, as Marx actually says, when it does, it's actually a bit of a miracle. It's an accident that supply and demand coincide. Normally they don't coincide. So let's suppose we start at time t equals 0 and we find, well, we're lucky enough to be on the supply, on the demand curve, but we're not on the supply curve. There was a bunch of theory around about 1930, which was sometimes called the Hog Cycle, sometimes called the Cobweb Theorem, which purports to explain how it is that if the price is not at the equilibrium, it will get to the equilibrium. And the theory goes something like this, that in the first period of time, what happens is that the suppliers, noting what the price is, decide, I'm going to produce so much corn or hogs or whatever it is, and so the quantity supplied increases. So more hogs come on the market. Then we get the supply hitting the market and people buy hogs or corn and they say, well, there's so much on the market, actually I can get a lower price. So the price then adjusts downwards. Next period, the farmers say, oh my God, the price has gone so low, I'm now going to produce less, and the quantity adjusts there. Now, I have perfectly consciously chosen these demand and supply curves, so you get what, I can't remember the names of it, it doesn't converge, it doesn't diverge, it goes on forever. Stable limit cycle. So this particular pair of curves would go on forever like that. The price would never actually be at the center. Now, that's not the final, smoking gun death of equilibrium, not at all. They're perfectly aware of this, and I have a series of explanations for that. And I'm going to go through those explanations and basically try to say these are two different ways of looking at the world, two different theories of reality, and I would have succeeded if at the end of it you understand what both these theories say. So I'm not trying to just sell you my theory. I mean, I am trying to sell you my theory, but I'm trying to tell you what the competition has to say, and I'm trying as accurately as I can to represent the competition, which corresponds to a way that both Andrew and myself believe it's very important that economists should approach economics, which we call pluralism. Our understanding of the task of an economist is actually to understand controversy, to understand difference, to understand why there can be several different theories of the world, and to test those different theories of the world against reality. And one of the problems with modern economics, which is why it is so singular to understand what's happening in this crisis, is not just that it has the wrong theory, but that it entertains the possibility of no other theory. It's called monotheoretic. And for those of you who are not economists, you may not realize how bad this is, because other disciplines are not as monotheoretic than economics. Economics, we did a study of this in the body I belong to, called the Association of Heterodox Economics. We checked out the ways a number of different British disciplines describe themselves, and we found that economics is actually more doctrinaire than theology. It's absolutely true, because if you are a theology student, you don't come and study theology in order to be told what to believe. You already know what you believe. What you understand is the relation between what you believe and what the other guy believes. And that's what theology does. Economics ought to do that. It doesn't. I'm trying to do it right. If I fail, you can grade me down and on the questionnaire, you can stop me. That's my intention. Now, we've now got two visions of the world, what Galileo called two world systems. We like to use that analogy. When Galileo came along and talked about whether the sun goes round the Earth or the Earth goes round the sun, he said, we see the same observed thing, stars and planets going through the sky, but there's two different ways of conceptualizing it. So I don't know if any of you follow Gary Lawson. There's a cartoon just like you've got dogs barking at night, and the guy talks to the dog, and there's what the dog hears and what the guy hears. So here is what the temperament is. Dog hears and what the guy hears. So here is what the temperament is. That's it with the temporalist. But the temporalist doesn't look at the potential equilibrium point. What the temporalist is concerned about is what is this sequence of events. And this can get complicated because, as we will see, the supply and demand curves can move. So in that case, when you get to here, you actually won't get to here at all. If the supply curves move, you'll get to here. And if the demand curves move, you'll get to somewhere else. So you see a sequence of points in time. And what you tend to be interested in, if you reason in a temporalist manner, is what is the average of those points. So look at the prices of any good over a period of, say, 7-10 years. They go up, they go down, but you can see a trend, a regularity in it. And you're interested in that. If you conceptualize it as an average, you don't think that behind that there is some equilibrium which he is trying to get to. I mean, I often use the image of a swarm of bees. Now, a swarm of bees stays close together, but that's not because each bee is looking for the nirvana of bee equilibrium. Okay? It's because it's trying to stay close to the other bees. That's how it works. So you can have, regular behavior, you can have trends, you can have averages, without any concept that at the center of it there has to be an equilibrium. That's the way we think. This is the way the simultaneous thinks. This is the reality, and all that moving around is just kind of accidental white noise deviation. Now, under what circumstances could both those theories hold true? I'll tell you, it's very simple. If the average is also equal to the equilibrium, both those theories would explain reality equally well. That's a very important thing to understand, because most of the real controversies, when you get down to it and stop, when you can finally call a halt to the mudslinging and the misrepresentation, the real scientific substance of the theoretical differences is does it make a difference in practice to distinguish between the average and the equilibrium? That, to me, is the scientific issue. Well, the first thing is just, where did simultaneism come from? I'm actually not going to spend a lot of time on this because Andrew has mainly explained it and I haven't really mentioned it, but it's just to show, if you want to check it out. I'm, by the way, going to put this presentation on my website, which is on academia, so I've got to Google me, so you'll be able to decipher what that reference actually is. Borkovich, writing in 1905, says the problem is that Alfred Marshall sorted out Ricardo because Ricardo tends to reason successively, whereas actually, as Valor showed, you have to look at mutual determination, and I'm going to do the same for Marx. So the whole idea was Valras and neoclassical general equilibrium sorted out Ricardo by getting rid of the latent successivism and getting the idea of general equilibrium. Now, Borkovich is going to do the same for Marx and make him mutual determination, equilibrium, simultaneism instead of temporalism. Then I've already introduced you to all these synonyms, so I can move on to the next one. What are the problems and how does simultaneism answer it? Well, first of all, as I pointed out, price and quantity never actually reach the equilibrium. Well, the basic response was probably best expressed not in relation to this problem, but it's the standard approach of neoclassical theory by Milton Friedman in 1953. In a very famous article defending what's called the as-if theory. And Friedman says, actually we know that in real life a tree turns its leaves towards the sun because there's a photosynthetic reaction which causes the sap to flow unevenly into different parts of the leaf, so it grows more this way and it turns to the sun. That's the explanation. However, is it wrong to say that the leaf is seeking to optimize the amount of sunshine it receives? No, it's right, because the leaf behaves as if it was seeking to optimize the amount of sunshine it receives, and therefore we don't need all the explanations. What we just need is, does the theory predict what is seen? So the first reaction of the neoclassical is always, does my econometric regression predict what I see? It's tremendous obsession. I work as an economist, believe me, they stand and fall on whether they predict. And it's amazing when a crisis comes along, because what they do is there's sort of a gap, and for about half a year they go and discuss, and then they come back and say, okay, we've got a new theory, and now we're going to predict what you'll see next. The fact that in the middle your theory went completely doolally just doesn't seem to influence the way they adjust their theoretical framework, but that's just by the by. And the framework is, if you can predict, it's good. The next one is this notion, if you left the system undisturbed, it will converge, and I'm going to explain what convergence is to the equilibrium. So it may be disturbed, but provided you hold it still, the price will come down to that equilibrium. That's the second idea, convergence. And then the third one is the idea I said, equilibrium. Average, and then there's a kind of fourth final port of call, which I hope I have time to deal with, which is a quite recent discussion, although it goes back. It started about 1950. The idea that equilibrium is the centre of gravity. If you think the price is being attached to this piece of elastic, pulling them away from equilibrium, and you're moving around, they will tend to want to snap back to that equilibrium point in the same way that the comets of the Earth tend to want to snap back towards the sun due to the force of gravity. That's the argument. So those are their three arguments. What's the problem? First of all, this is what convergence is. Now all I've done is given the same diagram, but I've changed the slope of one of these curves so that instead of going round in a circle, it does actually move closer and closer iteratively, as we say, towards the equilibrium. There are many examples of convergent processes in temporal or difference equation analysis. It's quite a common thing. There are two problems with it. First of all, it doesn't always occur. It only occurs when the demand and supply curves are in a certain configuration. But there's another more fundamental problem. And this goes on to do with the second argument about average. Okay? Which is, what I've done here is I've had the supply curve move while the adjustment is going on. So I haven't actually done a slide that shows this in the order which it occurs, so this is a neutral slide. But if you've got to imagine that when we get to t equals 2 here, meantime, the suppliers are getting more productive due to technological innovation. So the supply curve moves down, which means you get greater quantity for the same price, or a lower price for the same quantity, whichever way you want to think about it. This next step will then not go to here, it will go to here. So that already your moving average is going to change from one period to the next. And that's quite normal, because these disturbances in and of themselves have an effect on the system. You wouldn't expect a hog supplier just to react by making more hogs. The hog supplier is also going to say, is there a better way to make hogs, so I can outcompete the farmer next door? Now, I was going to use that, but I think time is a bit short, so there is a little bit of temporalism here. I'll go to the next one. This is something I prepared earlier. What we've got here is I have the supply and the demand curves both move according to the formula which I calculated. It's basically exponential. One goes that way exponentially, the other goes that way exponentially. This purple spot is the moving equilibrium, the point of intersection. This is the temporal part. Now you can just eyeball that and see where the moving average is. We have quantity along here and price along here. Neither is the moving average price equal to the moving equilibrium price, nor is the moving average constant. It's the moving average that's the moving equilibrium. So the theories discriminate. Now this still doesn't prove which theory is wrong or which theory is right. It just tells us that the two theories produce different answers. And as you'll see when Andrew gets this, they also produce different rates of profit. And the equilibrium rate of profit goes up, and the temporal rate of profit goes down. Okay, so they discriminate. So the next thing you've got to look at is, this is a summary of what I've just shown. The last thing is the central gravity, and then I'm going to go through a few instances in reality where I think the temporal explanation works better. So these are a series of quotes. We're kind of short of time. I'm really putting them on proud display just to show I've done my literature search. These guys, a lot of them use the metaphor of centre of gravity. And we have here, if I look at the names, Gary Monjovi, Kurtz and Salvadorian, Duminil and Levy, that's a wide range of Strathrians, Neo-Strathrians and Marxists, all saying that basically, okay, it's not quite an equilibrium, it's not quite a moving average, but it's a centre of gravity. Does that work? Basically, I wrote a paper in which I said it's not a logical argument, it's a metaphor. It's a nice sounding idea which substitutes for a logical step in the argument. In math, when I did math, we used to call that a hand-waving argument. The guy would go through a proof and he'd write every step of the proof on the board, that A follows B, and then you get to the final point where you have to get the answer, and the guy would wave his hand and say, it's like that. And they were relying on some intuition. It's what in literary parlance is called a trope, a non-logical method of persuasion. It's rhetoric, and the particular rhetoric is a metaphor. What I'm going to try is show is the metaphor is an inappropriate metaphor. Not only is it logically incorrect, it's even, for a literary student, incorrect. Because the centre of gravity doesn't behave like an equilibrium point, even if the equilibrium behaved the way these guys said. First of all, gravity is actually weaker the further away you get from the point of attraction. But in the way these guys talk in their quotes about the way that the equilibrium point is supposed to work, the further you are away from the equilibrium, the greater the pressure. If I'm selling a whole lot less than the market will bear, I can make a whole lot more profit by selling more. And the bigger the gap, the more I'm going to try. So, number one, the force analogy doesn't work. But secondly, actual centres of gravity are not equal to the moving average. So this is a planet here going around its centre of gravity in the top circle. This one shows where the Y position of the planet is over time. This one shows where the X position is. Now, if you think, what is the average position of the planet? Bearing in mind that when it's far away, because of the force thing, it's moving more slowly, which is why the loops at the bottom are big, as opposed to the loops at the top, where it's moving very fast. The average is actually going to be, I can't point to it, I didn't know I was going to get such a big screen, but here. Okay? It's in fact at the focus that is opposite to the center of gravity. So it's not even true that in a gravitational system, the center of gravity is equal to the moving average, or is equal, it's equal to the, in this case, it's not actually even equal to the equilibrium point. I'll tell you, because the equilibrium point, assuming these masses are comparable, is somewhere in between them. I mean, okay, it's an equilibrium if the Earth falls into the Sun, but, you know, the Sun would move a little bit towards the Earth in the process, so the equilibrium point is actually not, it's just a different idea. It has no explanatory role, in spite of the enormous amount of effort that has been invested into trying to construct equations of it. So last thing, is this now, we've shown it discriminates what real life issues are at stake. And now I'm going to say, now I'm on my sales pitch, pretty well everything. Pretty well everything you see in this crisis today, pretty well everything you see in this world today, the reason neoclassical economics gets this wrong is because equilibrium explanations don't explain what you see, and temporal explanations do. I wonder what caveat. Am I saying my temporal explanation explains the world? Why not? There are a variety of temporal explanations, and some of them explain the world. So the world is over, you've heard the lecture, when this is over, you go away and you make a temporal theory. But what Andrew and I would then attempt to say is this, that Marxist theory seems to work better than all the other temporal theories. Keynes has got a temporal theory, Minsky has a temporal theory, Koletsky has a temporal theory. For what it's worth, even the new institution, well, the old institutionalist Schiller has a quasi-temporal theory, okay? Casualty one, the rate of profit. Blue one, equilibrium profit rate going up. Red one, temporal profit rate going down. Next one, the motor force of capitalism. What actually makes capital grow? Why should a capitalist take capital out of something that is merely making the average rate of profit and put it somewhere else? If everybody is making the same rate of profit, there's nothing to be got from doing so. Yet the equilibrium solution doesn't work. You can't even get a mathematical solution unless all the profit rates are equal. Yeah.
So you're the same profit in one industry or in the entire economy?
Everything. I mean, if all economies, all firms have the same rate of profit, there's no reason for capital to move from one to the other. Now, what Marx actually says is the main motor force of capitalism is a profit above the average. Mandel calls it super profit. He just calls it a profit above the average. You look at, for example, why does technological innovation work? Because you can invest in a new process that produces twice as many widgets as the other guys. And then you, twice as many widgets for the same outlay, means you actually cost you half as much. So you get that excess, as long as the market, on average, is keeping at the old price, you get the difference as your profit. And capital will flow into that new process, it will grow as a part of that branch as a whole. If that branch as a whole is a driver branch of the economy, the rate of profit in that branch as a whole will be higher than the average. That's how capitalism moves from one state to another. And by the way, this even explains, I was expecting to find something else. Yeah, that explains the nationalisation. Okay, for my next trick I will demonstrate the crisis of capitalism. How does it work? You remember Andrew talked about money. In the way we look at money, the single system that matters is that the value of money is equal to its purchasing power over labour. It represents the labour it can purchase, not the labour that was used to create it. That means when prices are rising, the value of money is falling. When prices are falling, the value of money is rising. What is happening in a recession? Prices relative to at least their previous rate of inflation are falling, or they're growing less fast. That means if you hold on to money, Without doing anything with money, the value that money commands will be rising. So of course you're going to hold on to money instead of investing in production, for as long as those prices are falling. But that's a positive feedback process. You are withdrawing capital from production into speculation. That causes the economy to descend still further. That causes prices to still further. That causes you to retreat into earning monetary assets. So it's a self-reinforcing positive feedback loop, which is yet another objection to the theory of equilibrium. Is divergence occurs when you have positive feedback loop, convergence only occurs when you get negative feedback loop. This is a classic example of positive feedback loop. And the last example of positive feedback loop, this is my index of work quality. I'm not going to explain how it's calculated. I'm just going to say, during the era of globalization, quote unquote, from here, scare quote unquote, unscare quote globalization, from 1980 to 2000, this is an index of inequality. So equality, so the lower that goes, the more unequal the world is between the advanced nations of the world and the rest of the world. And between when financial deregulation started and 2000, it basically it went up by a factor of about 2.5. The rich nations of the world at the beginning of that process were 10 times richer in per capita GDP than the poor ones. At the end of it, they were 25 times. So how could that happen? Free trade, deregulation, capital markets, greatest extent the world market has ever seen. It was the period in which inequality grew the most. There must be a positive feedback. And many people have written about this, starting with the theorists of unequal exchange, Prebisch and Singer, who might like to look up, their names ought to be coming back round about now, who said, it doesn't work like Ricardo says. If you get one place specializing in capital, it has a monopoly of increasing its productivity. So the productivity differential between the advanced countries and the poor countries gets bigger. That means they get more super profit. They use that super profit to invest. What do they invest in? Making themselves more productive. You have a positive feedback loop, which is leaving those who already have the means, access to the means of innovation, increasing their access to the means of innovation at the expense of those who do not. Many, many different theories of that. All of them amount to the same thing. It's a temporal process, and it's a positive feedback loop, and that's the only thing that explains, during the greatest expansion the market has ever seen, the real factor of inequality multiplied by 2.5. I'm now done. Thank you very much. Cheers for giving me so much time. I'm taking it so much. I can move the chair. You're the chair. You're the boss. Okay.
When you're the boss, tell me how I wake up. No. Well, the most important law of modern political economy, I have become convinced it's the most important law to understand the recent crisis, not in the sense of the rate of profit fell and then we had a crisis, but there was a persistent fall in profitability in the U.S. corporate sector all throughout the post-World War II period. And it's not a matter of the rate of profit continuing to fall, but rather the situation of falling profitability was never overcome, but they didn't want a new Great Depression. They kept artificially expanding the economy with debt and more debt and more debt. We've had this persistent debt bubbles, and basically, the most recent, we had the dot-com bubble, all kinds of things. The most recent one was the rise in the home prices and the rise in the stock market, and we've had a very big crash. But underlying this is the sluggish profitability. Just click on the slideshow, it should be okay. Okay, here's my mouse. You do it. Here we go. Okay, so I want to do one more of these corn examples. It's called a corn model. Okay, so the money figures are going to be green. Okay, American money is green. Labor is obviously red, right? But corn, you can't even see the yellow. Actually, it's disappeared there. So, no, instead of imagining yellow, yeah, we're going to have blue corn. Okay. So what we have here is it's called a corn model, but this is a blue corn model. Okay. And that coming up, if you're young, that's a test of whether you're paying attention. But if you're old, that's a test of your eyesight. www.schroffen.com. Okay, so we have a model using with some assumptions, and we're going to be working with these. We want to look at the simplest case possible, not to be realistic, but for reasons of time. So there's going to be a one-sector economy, corn economy. You plant corn, you get corn out. There's no fixed capital, no machinery, anything like that. You just seed corn planted at the start of the year, living labor, they produce corn output. Importantly, here we're going to assume that all of the output, the corn, is plowed back literally into production. So it becomes the seed corn in the next period, and if all corn's doing that, the farm workers are going to be living on air, and the farm owners are going to be living on air as well. Okay? Just for simplicity, to try to get some results in the space that we have. A couple of other assumptions. Okay. Corn production is going to rise by 25% in here. Okay. So the growth rate of corn is as high as an elephant's eye, and it looks like it's climbing right up to the sky, but there won't be any increase in employment. Not even falling to 1,000 jobs a month, no increase. Okay, so we've got the years, the capital investment, that the seed corn, the surplus is the increase between the beginning and the end of the year, the output's the corn output, and then we compute the rate of profit, which is the surplus divided by the capital. Okay. So let's first look at the physical figures. In year one, again, remember corn is blue, 256 bushels of corn are planted, 320 is the output, so the surplus is 64. 64 divided by 256, that's 25% rate of profit. Capital is what they start with, the planting of the corn. The output's what they end with. The difference is the surplus. Okay, now in year two, the important thing to see here is all of the outputs plowed back. So the 320 bushels of corn all becomes the capital of the next period. It's all planted in the ground, 25% increase, 400. The difference is 80, that's the surplus. 80 divided by 320. Again, that's 25%. So again, in the third period, we ended the prior period with 400 bushels. All of that is planted with seed, 25% increase in everything. Okay, so we have 500 bushels. Again, the rate of profit is 25%. And so you get these figures for the fourth period. Now, if we let the corn rise at an increasing rate, we would get a higher rate of profit. Okay. And if we had some wages in here, and workers consumed the same amount of corn, the value of the corn would go down because of the increasing productivity. In either of those cases, with an increasing rate of increasing corn, or workers' physical wages declining, which they aren't here because they're already at zero, in either case you would have a rising rate of profit. And that's what the Untitled Theorem is basically about. Okay? Labor-saving technological change, increases in productivity like we have here. The same amount of labor producing ever more and more corn, that cannot cause the rate of profit to fall, according to Ocasio, but that has everything to do with simultaneous valuation, which basically always leads to these kind of physicalist results, physicalist, in terms of the physical amount of corn. But now let's look at value, first of all, in terms of labor. Okay, so in the first period, let's assume that 1 labor hour is equal to 1 bushel of corn, or 1 labor hour produces a bushel of corn. So the figures are exactly the same for labor and for corn. Okay, now what's going to be, in labor time terms, the capital at the start of the second period. All the corn is being plowed back into production. So what's the capital going to be in labor time terms? All the corn is being plowed back. 320. Okay. Well, you're a very good Marxist, but you're a very bad Marxist economist. Okay. So Marxist economists, the simultaneous, would say the answer is actually 256. But I think you're right. Okay. All the corn is being plowed back. The corn at the end of last year had a total value of 320. The end of last year is the beginning of this year, so it's the same 320. That's a temporal argument. Okay. Now, the same 64 hours of labor because there's no increase in employment. So 320 and 64 together is 384. 64 divided by 320 is not 25%, but only 20%. We got a falling rate of profit here. And what about next year? What's going to be the capital at the start of year 3 in labor time terms? All of the corn is being plowed back. What's going to be the capital? 384. You're another person who's a good Marxist, but a bad Marxist economist. Marxist economist, simultaneously again say it's going to be 256. Okay, but I like your answer. So we get 384 to 64. Rate of profit falls to 17%. We have a better Marxist economist there, but for reasons of time, I'll just move on for right now. Okay, so the same thing next period, we're going to have 448. And there. Now, one very important limitation here is capitalists don't care about the labor time, and the consumers pay money and they care about their money profits. So there's a limitation just doing this all in terms of labor time, labor time value. Well, there's reality prices and money prices, and they affect money profits, and that's what capitalists care about. Okay, so what if the monetary expression of labor time, the number of dollars of value created per hour of labor, what if that increases by 10% a year? Let's look at that. Okay, now we've got just a different set of numbers here to make it simple, with the same basic assumptions. We start with 2,000, 1,000 labor, living labor, that's 3,000, it all gets plowed back, 3,000, new value added, 1,000, 4,000, it all gets plowed back, so the new value at the start of the next year as capital is 4,000, 1,000, added, okay, 5,000, and so forth. So that's the labor, but nobody knows or sees labor time determinations. If this were to continue forever, you have the same 1,000 in surplus value, more and more capital being built up, 1,000 extra every year, the rate of profit would just go down to zero if this were to continue forever. Okay. Now what about with the money? Okay. 3,300 at the end of year 1, that's 10% more than the 3,000. Okay. So the rate of profit is higher. Okay. Now, you get the 3,300 over here instead of the 3,000. 4840, that's 10%, it's compounded, so it's 21% more. The rate of profit is still higher, 47% rather than 33, but it's falling, just like the other one. Okay? And you do the same thing for the next period. This is 33% more, because it's 10% per year, it's being compounded. So the rate of profit is still higher than the labor time rate. The money rate of profit is 38 versus 25, but it's still falling. And this just keeps continuing. Okay, you can do the numbers for yourself. I work out a more detailed example in Chapter 7 of my book, but for any example in which you have no fixed capital, the following is always the case. 1 plus the money rate of profit is equal to 1 plus the growth rate of this monetary expression of labor time, which is here 10%, plus 1 plus times 1 plus the labor rate of profit. So the growth rate of if the growth rate of the monetary expression of labor time is constant, here it was a constant 10%, then the money and the labor rates of profit, they differ. The money rate is way higher, but they're going down together. They have the same trend. Okay? So, yeah, prices rise above values, but if they're rising above values at the same rate, the trend in the money rate of profit is basically the same as the trend in the labor rate of profit, determined by labor time. What's this have to do with the real world? A lot. Okay. These are actual figures that I computed from U.S. Government Bureau of Economic Analysis statistics. Property income, that's basically the gross value added of corporations, subtract the depreciation, subtract the compensation of employees. So it's whatever part of net value added the workers don't get as a percentage of the historical cost of fixed assets, their equipment and buildings at the actual purchase prices minus depreciation. Okay. So that's one way of measuring the rate of profit. Okay. The labor rate of profit, goes down, 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 just like in Alan's graph. The money rate of profit, it fluctuates, but the trend is pretty similar. Okay. With the exception of the blip due to the asset bubble at the end, in the early mid part of the present decade, we've got a downward trend, which is rather similar to the trend in the labor rate of profit. Okay. The gap between the two things is pretty constant. Here's the gap. That's the money rate of profit minus the labor rate of profit. Okay. That's a measure of the influence of the melt, the rise in money prices over and above the labor time values. So the money rate of profit is basically, on average, about 20 percentage points greater than the labor rate of profit, but there's not much of a trend. There's really no trend here. So you have one number, and you got another number basically about 20% higher. Where if the one number is going down, the other number is going down. So this is, in fact, the dominant cause of the fall in the rate of profit, because distribution had very little impact. The dominant cause of the fall in the actual money rate of profit, not like wages versus profits, but the decline of this labor rate of profit, the rate of profit that Marx basically talked about over time. That's pulling down the money rate of profit because prices are higher than values, but the rate of increase was basically constant. Okay, so on my website you have a crisis intervention page, and the moral of this story is I ain't going to work with Schroff's farm.
Is falling rate of profit equitable to diminishing marginal returns? Is that being clear?
I wouldn't say so. I mean, you're looking at Marxist study, Marxist natural which is what is normally in my business studies would be called the rate of return. Now, the idea that it's the marginal return, I would describe as a theory rather than an empirical description. So, whether it's equal to the marginal rate of return on capital would depend on whether that theory was correct. In other words, if somebody says to me, okay, I can predict the rate of profit, it's going to be, I can predict the rate of return on capital, it's going to be equal to the marginal rate of return on capital, I would say, make your prediction and that's it.
I agree with you, so. Yeah. We don't agree about it.
All right, so I wonder if y'all can address, as I understand, Marx's rate of profit has to do with this whole idea of rising organic composition of capital, increasing, constant capital over variable. This being more or less as I understand. And so that was the basis of how I understand his falling rate of profit as he understood it at the time. And others have argued, including Sweezy being one of them, that explanation for the decline of, Sweezy never argued against the fact that profit rates were in fact falling, but that they were no longer falling due to this rising organic composition of capital, because this whole idea of capital goods sectors being this, being constantly being able to soak up excess capital was no longer the case post the Industrial Revolution. After a country had largely been industrialized, this capital goods sector was no longer able to take that up, and there's no reason to think that there was this constant rise in this organic composition of capital due to the changing nature of capitalism itself. And he said, based on that argument, he says that this falling rate of profit due to rising organic composition of capital just doesn't fit the historical data as what he would argue competitive capitalism entered into corporate or monopoly capitalism. I wondered if you could address how that fits in.
It fits in exactly because Sweezy's argument is a simultaneous argument. What is at the core of what he's saying is that the means of production per worker increase. He doesn't deny that. Okay, but the value or organic composition of capital is not the actual means of production, but their cost, their value. And he says if they become cheaper, okay, then say if we extract, okay, I'm going to have to make this short. But he says that the value composition of capital doesn't rise. Now, in the long run, I think he's probably right, but in the long run, you have an airplane that takes off, and then it lands, and would you conclude that it never gets off the ground? Because it starts off on the ground, and it ends on the ground, and in equilibrium, it's always on the ground. And that's the problem with Sweezy's argument. Okay? What happens is there are these crashes like the ones we're living through now, and that devalues the capital. So Marx was basically saying, yeah, you get the build-up, you get the crash, that's where the devaluation of capital, the destruction of capital value is manifested. So Marx is not thinking of just like a long-term decline in the rate of profit throughout history. He actually says the tendency for the rate of profit to fall always has to be overcome by way of crises. The crises destroy the capital value that was built up. Okay? And that brings down the value composition of capital, and that creates the new boom.
Okay. All right. Yeah, all right. Good.
If profit rates are decreasing, aren't absolute profit terms always decreasing? Because if the rate of
absolute
profit,
massive profit,
yeah, would that be
basically it's always
the
increasing.
area under the curve is not always increasing?
That's a very interesting question, because one of the things we've been trying to look at the empirics of the profit rate. And one of the factors that is very important is the rate of profit can go on increasing if there is an increased production of value. Now, because it's labour, only two ways you can get that. Either you can get people working who are not working before, or you can make people work for longer. Now, one of the characteristics of the US economy throughout the 50s was that it was demographically growing very rapidly, much faster than Europe. So that you have a population rate of increase, including the population itself, something like 3% per year. Yeah. So basically, that is a counteraction tendency. But accumulation proceeds at, let's say, 5% a year, growth of labour force 3% a year, the rate of profit goes on down. So I forget exactly what the original question was, but that's the thing. The mass of profit is basically going to be proportional to the amount of labour that's going on, less the cost of that labour. Of course, there's another way you can increase and offset that process is to decrease the value you give to the workers. The key thing is that whereas there's an absolute limit on wage cutting, there's no limit on accumulation. You just go on until it stops, and it stops in the process. I don't know if that answers your question.
What would that falling profit rate curve look like? Would it be descending? Would it be?
It would be descending, but not descending so. It doesn't descend so fast as if the population is static. There's a residual offsetting effect, which is now beginning to wind down. So that offset not so much of that. versus the main very patient.
Oh, I didn't see this.
If you want, it's all right. I asked it earlier. Is it okay to raise that question at this point?
Which question?
Question about your labor accounting in your example there.
Okay, sure.
Your numerical example with your red figures, you have a fixed level of deployments of a given quantity of living labor, and yet you have output levels that rise. Yet you continue to attribute one labor hour to each unit of corn when you put your next capital numbers in the successive rows. You have rising productivity, and yet you didn't have any sort of valuation effect in terms of capital. None at all. Is that legitimate?
The total amount of workers was constant. The corn was increasing, so the amount of corn produced per labor hour was increasing.
But also the amount of labor attributed labor per unit of corn is decreasing.
Correct.
And yet you valued each year's output at the same number when you plugged it in as the next year's input. You didn't take account of that.
No, actually, the value per unit is declining there due to the higher productivity. The value per unit is declining. Why don't you take the question now and I'll get back to this?
Yeah, this is probably pretty simple. I don't plan to be an economist.
That means you're probably better at economics.
If we eschew the simultaneous model or whatever, and think in terms of temporality, do we still hold certain basic assumptions about supply and demand? Because what's implicit in this argument is with the reduction of socially necessary labor time, the production of more goods on the market, that the supply curve then would go up, and this is somehow related to the drop in price. So I'm just trying to, can we still think in terms of, a glut of commodities on the market and prices going down, like basic assumptions?
Okay, yeah. I was very careful when I constructed my presentation to make sure that the temporalists and the simultaneous were making exactly the same assumptions. So the answer to your question would be yes. In that presentation, there is no difference between what we each assume. In other words, let me put it this way. The reason for the difference is not that we're assuming a different economic behavior. Okay? Having said that, I would actually take issue with many, for reasons that have nothing to do with temporalism. I would take issues with many of the standard-based assumptions of neoclassical economics. So I hope that answers.
Yeah.
Okay, let's just briefly. In the end of the first year, the labor is 320, the output's corn is 320. So it's 1 labor hour per bushel. That continually decreases the labor, the value in terms of labor time per bushel does get smaller and smaller. So it's only about 80% or so by the end of year 4.
Yeah, another way of saying that is, yes, the value goes down, but not as fast as for the simultaneous model. And the reason is that what you effectively do, if you say that the value is going to be determined by the assumption that at the beginning of the period you already had the productivity that you had at the end of the period, what you're actually doing is wiping out value. It doesn't fall by as much as the simultaneous state does.
You have rising labor productivity in this example, right? And yet you continue to value each unit of corn at 1 labor hour.
No. If I valued each unit of corn at 1 labor hour, this 625 bushels would have a total value of 625.
But from one period to the next, that's...
But here, the end of year 3 is the beginning of year 4. It's the same time.
I'll throw it.
I actually have a similar question.
Can you speak up, please?
In the presentation, this was just the one thing that I also I couldn't follow this one move of how the output becomes necessarily the input.
Okay. That is, it's purely an assumption that at the end of the year, the corn farmers take all of the corn, they don't eat any, they don't pay workers, just for simplicity, it's not realistic, and instead they take all the corn and they plant it as seed for the next year. Just a simple assumption meant to generate some numbers without, well, that part goes to wages, and they eat that part, and they invest that. It's just too much for a simple presentation. So I made it like all the corn goes back into the ground.
So thank you.